Before we start, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. What city, what country? We want to know how far this story reaches. Because this is a story about a weapon that slave catchers never feared. A simple wooden bow, a tool for hunting rabbits and deer, something children played with in the woods, but in the hands of someone who could barely see. Someone who had learned to hunt by sound and shadow. Someone who had 7 years to turn near blindness into an advantage. That simple bow became a weapon that terrified the Kentucky forest. This is the story of Thomas Carter, a child when an overseer's whip destroyed most of his vision. A teenager when his campaign began. A young man when it ended. 13 slave catchers dead, but not without cost. 3 misses that nearly got him killed. To years of failed attempts before his first success and psychological scars that haunted him for 60 years. Over 300 enslaved people escaped to freedom through the corridor he created. And he was never caught, though he came within minutes of capture twice. They called him the Ghost Archer, the Shadow Hunter, the boy who shoots from darkness, but his real name was Thomas. And this is how a nearly blind boy with a bow brought terror to the men who hunted his people, paid the price in ways that broke him, and became a hero despite never wanting to kill anyone. 13 men. That's how many slave catchers died in the forests of Kentucky during those years before the Civil War began. 13 men who made their living hunting human beings who had escaped slavery. 13 men who owned bloodhounds and rifles and chains. 13 men who tracked runaways through forests and swamps. Who collected bounties measured in dollars per captured person returned alive. 13 men killed by arrows over 5 years. But the number doesn't tell the story of the failures. The arrows that missed completely in early attempts. The slave catcher Thomas wounded but didn't kill, who nearly identified him before dying days later. The night Thomas's bowstring snapped mid-draw, leaving him defenseless close to armed men. The kills that worked were precise, but they came after years of mistakes that could have ended everything. Wooden shafts tipped with sharpened iron, fired by someone who saw the world as blurred shapes and shadows, who hunted by combining limited vision with extraordinary hearing. Someone who could see movement and light, but not details, who aimed at the fuzzy outline of a man's torso and hoped the arrow found the heart. 13 men who went into the Kentucky forest hunting escaped slaves, and never came back. And the person who killed them was a boy who had lost 95% of his vision as a child, who spent 7 years learning to shoot despite seeing targets as little more than dark smudges against lighter backgrounds. Thomas Carter was born enslaved on the Harrison Plantation in Christian County, Kentucky. 3,000 acres of tobacco and hemp cultivation owned by Robert Harrison. Thomas's mother, Clara, worked as a house servant. His father, William, worked as a carpenter. Thomas grew up healthy and energetic with perfect eyesight. A bright child who could spot birds in trees from far away. One summer, when Thomas was a young boy, everything changed. Thomas had been assigned to carry water to field hands during tobacco harvesting in brutal Kentucky summer heat. An overseer named Marcus Webb supervised the harvest, known as one of the cruelest overseers in the county. One day, Thomas was bringing water when he stumbled on a root and fell, spilling the bucket. Webb called him over. Thomas's father, William, was nearby repairing a wagon. He saw Webb raise his whip and ran toward them, shouting, "No, he's just a child, please." Webb turned to face William. "You want to take his punishment." William stopped, knowing interference meant death, but this was his son. "Sir, he's just a boy. Please don't hurt him for spilling water." Webb considered this, then said, "Fine, I won't hurt him for spilling water. I'll hurt him for having a father who questions my authority." Webb swung the whip not at Thomas's back, but at his face. The leather struck Thomas across both eyes with devastating force. Thomas screamed and fell, blood pouring through his fingers, covering his face. The plantation doctor, Dr. Reynolds, examined Thomas days later. Both eyes were severely damaged. The right eye's cornea was shredded, leaving Thomas able to perceive only light and darkness from that eye, no shapes or details. The left eye was less damaged, but still catastrophically injured with torn retina and clouded lens that reduced vision to blurred shapes and colors with no ability to see details. Beyond short distances, Dr. Reynolds' assessment, Thomas retained approximately 5% of normal vision. He could see vague shapes, distinguish light from dark, perceive movement and general outlines of objects, but could not see faces, read text, or identify anything requiring detail for practical purposes. Thomas was functionally blind. He would never again see his parents' faces clearly, never read, never see the world as anything but shadows and fuzzy impressions. He was a child and his life had been destroyed. Marcus Webb faced no consequences. The incident was recorded as Thomas Carter vision damage due to accident with whip. After time, Thomas's bandages were removed. His right eye was whitish and sightless. His left eye looked almost normal, but saw the world as if looking through thick fog. Everything was blurred, indistinct, shadows moving against lighter backgrounds. He could navigate by seeing obstacles as dark shapes, but couldn't identify what they were without touching them. His father, William, proposed to Harrison that Thomas could work simple tasks. Harrison agreed because William's carpentry was valuable. Thomas was assigned to gardens, pulling weeds, and collecting vegetables by feel. Something unexpected happened during recovery. As Thomas's brain adapted to severe vision loss, his other senses compensated dramatically. Within months, he could identify people by footsteps from a distance. He could hear conversations happening far away. He could detect temperature changes indicating walls nearby. His remaining vision, limited as it was, became more useful as his brain learned to extract maximum information from minimal visual input. He could see a person as a dark blur against lighter background and estimate their position and movement, even if he couldn't see their face. William noticed this and began teaching Thomas skills for someone with severe vision impairment. Most importantly, William taught Thomas to hunt by combining limited vision with sound. William had learned bow hunting as a child and believed teaching Thomas would give him purpose. They started with a simple bow and arrows with fire-hardened points. At first, it seemed impossible. How could someone who saw the world as shadows aim a bow? But William taught Thomas to use what vision he had combined with sound. Thomas could see a target as a dark shape if it contrasted with the background. He couldn't see details, but he could see that something was there, roughly where it was and approximately how big. Combined with hearing the target's movement and position, Thomas developed a hybrid hunting technique. Use ears to locate precisely. Use limited vision to confirm target position as fuzzy shape. Aim at the center of the blur and shoot. The first 1,000 shots missed completely. Thomas would hear where something was, but his blurred vision couldn't confirm it. Or he'd see a shape but misjudge distance. But Thomas was patient. After some years, he could hit stationary targets at close range that he could see as dark shapes against lighter backgrounds. As he grew older, his range improved. Something extraordinary happened one day. Thomas was hunting in forests at twilight when his limited vision worked best because contrasts were strongest. He heard a rabbit some distance away and saw it as a small dark shape moving against the lighter ground. He drew his bow, aimed at the blurry shape, calculated movement by sound, led the target by instinct, and loosed an arrow. The arrow struck the rabbit, killing it. Thomas had just killed a moving target while seeing it only as a shadow. He stood there understanding. His severe vision impairment wasn't just disability. Combined with enhanced hearing, it was an advantage in low-light conditions where normal-sighted people struggled. He could hunt at dusk and dawn when others couldn't see clearly, but he could still detect shapes and had sound to guide him. Thomas was still young. He had been nearly blind for years, and he had discovered he could be dangerous. Over the next years, Thomas became highly skilled at hunting in conditions others found impossible. But he wasn't supernatural. He missed frequently. Of every 10 shots at moving targets, he hit perhaps 3 or 4. Stationary targets were easier, maybe 6 of 10. He learned his limitations. Beyond a certain distance, targets became too blurred to aim at reliably. In full darkness, He was as helpless as anyone else because he needed to see shapes, even fuzzy ones. In bright sunlight, everything washed out, and his damaged eyes couldn't distinguish contrast. His effective range was at dawn or dusk against targets that moved slowly enough for him to track by sound and sight combined. Within those limitations, he was deadly. Outside them, he was just a nearly blind boy with a bow. His father, William, watched this skill develop with pride and fear. "This is for hunting food," William told Thomas repeatedly. "Never for people, you understand?" Thomas understood. He had never thought about using his bow on people. That thought came one day when everything changed. A woman named Sarah had escaped from Harrison Plantation running toward Ohio. She was caught by slave catchers Daniel Morrison, his brother Robert Morrison, and James Sutton. They specialized in hunting runaways with bloodhounds, paid per person returned alive. Sarah was dragged back in chains and brought to the whipping post. Robert Harrison ordered lashes. Marcus Webb, the overseer who had destroyed Thomas's eyes years earlier, prepared the whip. Thomas stood in the crowd, forced to watch. He couldn't see the whipping clearly, just web shape moving, and the whip as a dark blur. But he heard everything, the crack of leather on flesh, Sarah's screams, the wet sound of blood hitting dirt, all the lashes. Sarah's screams turning to silence as she lost consciousness. After the whipping, the slave catchers were paid and left laughing. Thomas stood in the twilight shadows listening and felt something crystallize inside him. For years, he had lived with his vision damaged, had turned it into strength, had become a hunter, and for what? To hunt rabbits while people like Sarah were hunted and beat nearly to death for wanting freedom. While Marcus Webb destroyed children's eyes and faced no consequences, Thomas made a decision. He would use his skill not for hunting food, but for hunting slave catchers, the men who made escape impossible, the men who dragged people back for money. Those men could be killed, and Thomas might be the only person who could kill them without being caught because he could kill at dusk and dawn when normal-sighted people struggled, but he could still see shapes, had sound to guide him precisely. The first year after that decision, Thomas did not kill anyone. This was preparation, but also fear. Thomas wasn't a killer. The thought of shooting a human being terrified him, but the memory of Sarah's screams and Webb's casual cruelty overcame the fear gradually. Thomas spent that year gathering intelligence through his father's contacts with enslaved people on other plantations. He learned slave catchers' patterns. They worked mostly at night when runaways traveled, used bloodhounds to track scent, traveled in small groups, followed predictable routes toward the Ohio River. Most critically, slave catchers were vulnerable when spread out searching forest terrain at dusk, the exact time when Thomas's limited vision worked best, combined with his hearing. While gathering intelligence, Thomas trained obsessively. Every evening at dusk, he would practice shooting in low-light conditions that matched when he'd need to kill. He learned his accuracy rate. At close range against stationary targets in twilight, he hit most shots. At further distances, his accuracy dropped. Beyond a certain point, his vision was to blur to aim reliably. These weren't supernatural numbers. They meant that killing a slave catcher would require getting close, waiting for ideal conditions, and accepting that he might miss and be killed. He practiced until his arms ached, shooting thousands of arrows, not because practice made him perfect, but because practice increased his odds from impossible to merely dangerous. After a year, Thomas was ready to attempt his first kill. He had identified Daniel Morrison as the target, one of the three who had captured Sarah. Morrison operated primarily in Christian County. Through plantation networks, Thomas learned that a man had escaped and Morrison was searching forests alone with bloodhounds. This was Thomas's opportunity, but everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Thomas positioned himself near a creek at dusk. He climbed into a tree and waited. Morrison appeared as a blurred dark shape moving through lighter forest, his bloodhounds baying. Morrison stopped near the creek, some distance from Thomas's tree. Thomas could see Morrison as a fuzzy outline, could hear him breathing heavily. Thomas drew his bow. His hands were shaking. This wasn't a rabbit. This was a human being. And despite everything, Thomas's hand shook. He aimed at the center of the blurred shape representing Morrison's torso and loosed the arrow. The arrow missed completely, passing to Morrison's side and hitting a tree. Morrison spun toward the sound, drawing his pistol. Thomas froze in the tree, holding his breath. Morrison searched the shadows for maybe half a minute while Thomas remained absolutely still. Finally, Morrison decided it was nothing, probably a branch falling, and continued walking. Thomas sat in that tree for a long time after Morrison left, his heart pounding, understanding how close he had come to being shot. He had missed. His first attempt to kill a slave catcher had failed because his hands shook and his aim was off. This wasn't a story about a supernatural archer who never missed. This was a terrified, nearly blind boy who almost got himself killed trying to shoot someone and missed completely. Thomas tried again some time later, different target. James Sutton, another of the men who captured Sarah. Sutton was searching alone near a river crossing at dusk. Thomas positioned himself behind a large oak tree close to where Sutton was searching. This was closer than the previous attempt, within his better accuracy range. Thomas could see Sutton as a dark blur against the lighter river background. He waited until Sutton stood still, examining dog tracks. Thomas drew, aimed at the center of Sutton's fuzzy outline, and loosed. The arrow hit Sutton, but not where Thomas aimed. Thomas had targeted the chest, but the arrow struck Sutton in the right shoulder, penetrating deep, but not hitting anything vital. Sutton screamed and fell, clutching his shoulder. Thomas ran. He was away within seconds, moving through forest he had memorized. Behind him, he heard Sutton shouting for help, crashing through underbrush, trying to pursue, but wounded and losing blood. Thomas kept running before stopping. He had failed again. He had hit his target, but hadn't killed him. Sutton was wounded, possibly fatally if infection set in, but alive and able to identify that someone had shot him with an arrow. Thomas went home terrified that Sutton would report the attack and investigations would follow, but luck intervened. Sutton, wounded and alone in forest, tried to make it back to town, but collapsed from blood loss. He was found dead days later, having bled out slowly from the shoulder wound. The death was mysterious, but investigators assumed Sutton had been attacked by a desperate runaway and had survived long enough to walk some distance before succumbing. No one suspected Thomas, but Thomas knew he had gotten lucky. If Sutton had made it back alive and described being shot from ambush, investigations would have intensified. Thomas had made 2 attempts to kill slave catchers and had missed completely once and wounded rather than killed once, only succeeding because his target bled out over days. This wasn't mastery. This was fumbling attempts by a scared teenager who couldn't see clearly and whose hands shook when trying to kill people. Thomas didn't try again for many months. He was traumatized by the failures and Sutton's slow death. He had nightmares about Sutton bleeding to death alone in the forest, dying slowly because Thomas's arrow had hit shoulder instead of heart. The psychological weight was crushing. But later, Thomas learned that Marcus Webb had left Harrison Plantation to work as a slave catcher, a more profitable job. Webb was the man who had destroyed Thomas's eyes, the man who had blinded a child for spilling water. If Thomas was going to kill anyone, it had to be Webb. Thomas spent time tracking Webb's patterns. Webb was cautious, rarely working alone, always heavily armed. But one day, Webb was searching alone near a river at dusk, his preferred time to track, because runaways often approached water sources at that hour. Thomas positioned himself in tall grass some distance from the river bank, his bow ready, waiting until Webb appeared as a dark blur against the lighter sky. Webb stood at the river's edge examining tracks, his back to Thomas' stationary target at good twilight light conditions. This was as ideal as conditions could be. Thomas drew his bow. His hands were steadier than previous attempts. This was the man who had destroyed his life. Thomas aimed at the center of Webb's blurred shape, targeting where the heart should be, led slightly to account for any movement, and loosed. The arrow struck Marcus Webb between the shoulder blades, penetrating into his back. Webb made a choking sound and fell forward into the shallow water. Thomas waited, listening. Webb wasn't moving. No sounds of breathing. Thomas approached cautiously, seeing Webb's shape lying motionless in the water. Webb was dead, the arrow having penetrated deep enough to pierce his heart from behind. Thomas's third attempt to kill a slave catcher had finally succeeded, but only because conditions were perfect. Stationary target, close range, good light, back turn. Thomas stood over Webb's body and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no revenge fulfilled, just emptiness and nausea. He had killed a human being. Justified or not, he had ended a life, and the weight of that hit him immediately. He walked away from Webb's body and vomited behind a tree. Webb's body was found the next morning. Investigation concluded he'd been killed by a runaway, possibly using a makeshift bow. No one suspected Thomas because a nearly blind boy killing an armed man seemed impossible, but Thomas knew the truth. He had succeeded only because of luck and perfect conditions. The kills that followed over the next years came slowly and with continued failures. Kill 2. Daniel Morrison. Thomas's attempt on Morrison after previous failures where Morrison either didn't appear or appeared in conditions too dark or bright for Thomas to see clearly, finally succeeded by ambushing Morrison at dawn when Morrison was examining a campfire site. Arrow through the back. Kill 3. Robert Morrison, Daniel's brother, killed while separated from his group searching at dusk. Arrow through throat. But this kill was preceded by failed attempts when Robert had been too far away or moving too quickly for Thomas to hit reliably. The pattern repeated, multiple failed attempts for every successful kill. Long gaps between kills while Thomas waited for ideal conditions. Kill 4. George Patterson, attempts before success. Finally killed when Patterson stopped to examine his bloodhounds at dusk. Arrow through chest. Kill 5. Henry Blake, attempt succeeded when Blake bent to drink from creek. Arrow through back. Kill 6. Samuel Reed. Attempts succeeded at dawn with arrow through side, but Reed didn't die immediately. Reed survived long enough to crawl toward his horse before dying from blood loss, and Thomas heard him crying for help for minutes before silence came. The psychological cost of hearing a man die slowly was enormous. Kills followed this pattern over the next year and a half. Charles Whitmore, David Walsh, Michael Stone, Edward Carson, Frank Richardson, Thomas Henderson, and a final unnamed slave catcher. Each kill required multiple attempts, long waits for ideal conditions, and acceptance that Thomas hit maybe half his shots. Even under good circumstances, the psychological toll accumulated. Thomas wasn't a remorseless killer. He was a teenager who heard every death in detail through his enhanced hearing, who knew these men had families and lives despite choosing evil work, who carried the weight of 13 deaths, plus the men who died slowly from wounds. He had nightmares constantly. He would wake hearing Samuel Reed's cries for help, or Sutton bleeding to death over days, or Webb's final choking sounds. His mother, Clara, noticed he barely slept, that he jumped at sudden sounds, that he sometimes stood in the garden shaking for no apparent reason. Thomas was developing what modern medicine would call post-traumatic stress disorder, but at that time there was no name for it, and no treatment except enduring. What kept him going was not satisfaction or revenge, but the knowledge that his kills mattered even though they came at terrible cost to himself. The psychological impact on slave catchers was enormous. After years of Thomas's campaign, slave catchers in western Kentucky were terrified. 13 dead wasn't a huge number, but the mysterious nature of the deaths created fear disproportionate to the body count. Multiple slave catchers quit entirely. Those who continued worked in larger groups and avoided dusk and dawn hours when most deaths had occurred. This created gaps in the slave catcher network that runaways exploited. The first major escape enabled by Thomas's campaign happened after James Sutton's death. A family escaped and traveled through forests at dusk and dawn when slave catchers had become reluctant to search. All reached freedom because Daniel Morrison, who would normally have tracked them, was too afraid to hunt alone after his colleague Sutton had been found dead with an arrow wound. This pattern repeated. escape succeeding because slave catchers hung back in fear, traveling in groups instead of spreading out to search, avoiding the hours when the mysterious archer operated. Over the years, approximately 317 people successfully escaped from western Kentucky plantations to Ohio, compared to fewer in the years before Thomas's campaign began. Not all were directly because of Thomas, but his 13 kills created a corridor of reduced enforcement that made escapes significantly more likely to succeed. Thomas learned about some of these escapes through plantation networks. People he'd never meet whose faces he'd never see clearly, who reached freedom because slave catchers were too afraid to hunt effectively. This knowledge helped balance the psychological weight of 13 deaths, but didn't erase it. The final kill came years after the campaign began. The target was a slave catcher whose name Thomas never learned. Hunting alone at dusk near the Ohio River, Thomas positioned himself and waited. When the man appeared as a blurred shape, Thomas drew and shot. The arrow hit the man's chest. The man fell and died within minutes. Thomas's 13th kill. He was a young man. He had killed 13 slave catchers in years, but at enormous psychological cost. He had PTSD, nightmares, constant anxiety, guilt despite knowing the kills were justified, and then he decided to stop. Not because the war was ending, the Civil War wouldn't start for some time, but because Thomas was breaking. He couldn't sustain the psychological weight anymore. 13 deaths were enough. He had created the corridor he wanted. He had made slave catchers afraid. He had enabled escapes. Continuing would destroy him mentally. Thomas never killed again after that. He lived quietly on Harrison Plantation for more years until emancipation came. He was in his 20s when freed, severely visually impaired, but not completely blind, psychologically damaged, but alive. He traveled to Louisville and found work hunting for food using his dusk and dawn skills. Years later, he met Ruth, who had escaped to Ohio during the period when slave catchers were afraid to hunt. She had heard legends of the ghost archer, and when she learned Thomas had severe vision problems, but extraordinary hunting skills at dusk, she suspected. After months of conversation, Thomas told her everything. Ruth's response, "You saved my life. I escaped when the slave catchers were too afraid to search at dusk. You were the reason they were afraid. They married. They had children." Thomas worked as a hunter and bow maker, never killing humans again. Many years later, Thomas was old and dying. A journalist named Frederick Davis interviewed him. Davis asked about the 13 kills. Thomas's answer, "I feel guilt for all 13. They chose evil work, but they were human beings, and I ended their lives. Some died slowly, and I heard them dying. That sound never left me. I had nightmares for 60 years. But I also know that people reached freedom because I made slave catchers afraid to hunt. 13 deaths for lives saved. I'll face God with those numbers and let him judge whether I was right." Thomas Carter died weeks later. His grave reads simply Thomas Carter. He lived free. 13 men, that's how many slave catchers died in the forests of Kentucky between those years. 13 men who made their living hunting human beings who had escaped slavery. 13 men who owned bloodhounds and rifles and chains. 13 men who tracked runaways through forests and swamps. Who collected bounties measured in dollars per captured person returned alive. 13 men killed by arrows. Wooden shafts tipped with sharpened iron, fired from a bow by someone who hunted in low light. Someone who could hear a man's breathing at distance and calculate wind speed by feeling air against his face. Arrows that struck throats, hearts, with such precision that doctors examining the bodies couldn't understand how any archer could achieve such accuracy in darkness. 13 men who went into the Kentucky forest hunting escaped slaves and never came back. And the person who killed them was a boy who had lost most of his vision as a child, a teenager when he started. Self-taught, patient, invisible, hunting the hunters with a weapon they dismiss as primitive. For years, slave catchers in western Kentucky lived in fear. They traveled in larger groups. They avoided forests at night. Some wore crude armor made from leather and metal. It didn't matter. The arrows found them anyway. Through fog, through darkness, through rain, the nearly blind archer never missed enough to stop. And he was never identified until much later, until we tell you who he really was and how he learned to kill with limited sight. Thomas Carter was born enslaved on the Harrison Plantation in Christian County, Kentucky. 3. 0 acres of tobacco and hemp cultivation owned by a man named Robert Harrison, who believed that enslaved people needed constant discipline to prevent laziness and rebellion. Thomas's mother, Clara, worked as a house servant. His father, William, worked as a carpenter building and repairing structures across the plantation. Thomas grew up healthy and energetic, a bright child who learned quickly and smiled often despite the brutality surrounding him. His parents loved him fiercely and tried to shield him from the worst aspects of plantation life. An impossible task, but they tried nonetheless. One summer, when Thomas was a young boy, everything changed. Thomas had been assigned to carry water to field hands during tobacco harvesting. It was brutally hot work in the Kentucky summer, and Thomas was struggling to keep up with the demand. An overseer named Marcus Webb was supervising the harvest. Webb was known as one of the cruelest overseers in the county, a man who beat enslaved people for minor infractions or sometimes for no reason except his own entertainment. One day, Thomas was bringing water to a group of field hands when he stumbled on a root and fell, spilling the water bucket. Webb saw this and called Thomas over. "Boy, you just wasted water because you're clumsy," Webb said. Thomas apologized, his head down, terrified because he knew Webb's reputation. "Sorry, sir, I'll fill that bucket," Webb said. He pulled his whip from his belt, a leather bull whip designed for controlling livestock, but used regularly on human beings. "Turn around," Webb ordered. Thomas turned, his small back exposed. Webb raised the whip. Thomas's father, William, was working nearby, repairing a wagon. He saw what was about to happen and ran toward them, shouting, "No, he's just a child, please." Webb turned to face William. "You want to take his punishment." William stopped running. He knew that interfering with an overseer's discipline meant death, but this was his young son. William said quietly, "Sir, he's just a boy. Please don't hurt him for spilling water." Webb considered this for a few seconds. Then he said, "Fine. I won't hurt him for spilling water. I'll hurt him for having a father who questions my authority." Webb swung the whip not at Thomas's back, but at his face. The leather struck Thomas across both eyes with devastating force. Thomas screamed and fell to the ground, his hands covering his face, blood pouring through his fingers. Webb coiled his whip and walked away, leaving a young boy bleeding in the dirt while his father ran to him crying. Thomas Carter's eyes were severely damaged. The whip had struck with enough force to rupture both eyeballs. The plantation doctor, a white man named Dr. Reynolds, who served multiple plantations in the area, examined Thomas days later and confirmed what everyone already knew. Thomas would be severely visually impaired for the rest of his life. Both eyes permanently damaged beyond any possibility of full recovery. Thomas spent time in darkness and pain, bandages over his damaged eyes, his mother Clara sitting beside him day and night. His father William working during the day, but staying up all night watching over his son. Thomas cried, not from pain, but from the realization that he would never see clearly again, never see his parents' faces clearly, never see sunlight properly. He was a child, and his life had just been altered by a man who faced no consequences because harming a slave child was not treated as a serious crime. Under Kentucky law at that time, Marcus Webb continued working as an overseer. Robert Harrison did not fire or discipline him. The incident was recorded in plantation records simply as Thomas Carter blinded due to accident with whip. After time, Thomas's bandages were removed. There was scarred tissue. He could perceive light and darkness and vague shapes, but saw no details, severe functional vision impairment. His parents faced a terrible question. What would happen to their visually impaired son? Enslaved people who couldn't work effectively were often sold cheap to brutal plantations or simply abandoned. Thomas couldn't do field work easily. He couldn't do most skilled labor requiring sight. But William Carter made a proposal to Robert Harrison. William was a skilled carpenter, valuable to the plantation. He offered to work extra hours without additional food rations if Harrison would allow Thomas to stay on the plantation and work simple tasks that didn't require full sight. Harrison agreed because William's carpentry skills were genuinely valuable. Thomas was assigned to work in the plantation gardens pulling weeds and collecting vegetables, tasks he could do by touch and limited sight. But something unexpected happened during Thomas's recovery. As his eyes healed into limited usefulness, his other senses sharpened dramatically. This is documented in medical literature. People with severe vision loss often develop enhanced hearing, touch, and spatial awareness as the brain reallocates resources from visual processing to other senses. Thomas experienced this transformation intensely. Within months of losing most of his sight, he could identify people, their footsteps from a distance away. He could hear conversations happening far distant if he focused. He could feel temperature changes that indicated walls or buildings nearby. He could navigate the plantation grounds with increasing confidence using sound and air pressure and ground texture to build mental maps of his environment. His father, William, noticed this and began teaching Thomas skills that would work for someone with low vision. William taught Thomas to identify wood types by touch and smell. He taught him to use sound to locate objects in space. Most importantly, William taught Thomas to hunt by combining his limited sight with enhanced sound. William had learned about hunting as a child from his own father, and he believed that teaching Thomas to hunt would give the boy purpose and skill and something to take pride in despite his impairment. They started with a simple bow, a piece of curved oak with a leather string and arrows made from straight branches with fire-hardened points. William would take Thomas into the forest on Sundays, though one day enslaved people had a few hours of freedom, and teach him to shoot. At first, it seemed impossible. How could a nearly blind person aim a bow? But William taught Thomas to aim by a combination of blurred sight and sound. He would place a target, a piece of wood, or a clay pot, and tell Thomas to listen and look for the blur. Then William would tap the target with a stick. Thomas would hear the tapping, see the vague dark shape, calculate the direction and distance by sound and limited sight combined, and loose an arrow. The first 100 shots missed completely, but Thomas was patient and determined. He had nothing but time and limited vision and the desperate need to prove he could do something, anything, despite his impairment. As a young teenager, years after being injured, Thomas could hit a stationary target at short range if someone tapped it to give him audio location. As he grew older, he could hit targets at further distances without anyone tapping them just by having someone describe where they were and using his memory of the space and his blurred sight. Something extraordinary happened one day. Thomas was hunting alone in the forest, which his father now allowed because Thomas navigated woodland terrain better than many sighted people. Thomas heard a rabbit moving through underbrush some distance away. He couldn't see the rabbit clearly, obviously, but he could hear it and see a dark blur. The rustle of leaves, the slight scraping of claws on bark, the pattern of movement. Thomas drew his bow, aimed by sound and the blurry shape, calculated the rabbit's position and movement trajectory, led the target by instinct, and loosed an arrow. The arrow struck the rabbit through the chest, killing it instantly. Thomas had just killed a moving target while seeing it only as a shadowy blur, using his hearing and remaining sight. He stood there in the forest holding his bow, feeling the dead rabbit with his hands to confirm the hit and understood something profound. His vision impairment was not just a disability. In certain contexts, it could be an advantage. He could hunt in low light where sighted people struggled. He could shoot in conditions where others couldn't see targets clearly. And he had just demonstrated accuracy that would be difficult for most sighted archers under those conditions. Thomas was still young. He had been nearly blind for years, and he had just discovered he was a weapon. Over the next years, Thomas became a skilled archer. Blind or sighted, he hunted constantly, bringing back rabbits, squirrels, deer, wild turkeys. He developed techniques that compensated for lack of clear vision. He learned to calculate distance by sound reflection, listening to how his voice or a tall stone echoed off objects. He learned to detect movement by changes in ambient sound, hearing when something blocked or redirected wind. He learned to sense humans at distances, detecting breathing, heartbeat, footsteps that others couldn't perceive. His accuracy became remarkable. As a teenager, he could hit a rabbit at a distance in low light. As he grew older, he could hit a target the size of a man's head at distance without good light. His father, William, watched this skill develop with pride and growing fear. Pride that his nearly blind son had become extraordinary. Fear about what that skill might be used for. "This is for hunting food," William told Thomas again and again. "Never for people, never. You use this on a white man, they'll kill everyone on this plantation. You understand?" Thomas understood. He had never thought about using his bow on people. Not yet. That thought would come one night when everything changed. Thomas and his father were in their cabin at night when they heard commotion outside. Shouting, dogs barking, men running. Thomas and William went outside to find chaos. A woman named Sarah had escaped from the Harrison plantation days earlier, running toward Ohio and freedom. She had been caught by slave catchers just outside the plantation and was being brought back. The slave catchers were three men: Daniel Morrison, his brother Robert Morrison, and a man named James Sutton. They specialized in hunting runaways, owning a pack of bloodhounds trained to track human scent. They were paid per person returned alive. Sarah was being dragged back in chains, crying, begging for mercy. The slave catchers brought her to the center of the plantation where a whipping post stood. Robert Harrison, the plantation owner, came out to oversee the punishment. Marcus Webb, the overseer who had blinded Thomas years earlier, prepared the whip. Sarah was chained to the post. Harrison announced that she would receive lashes as punishment for escape attempt, and as warning to others, Webb began whipping. Thomas stood in the crowd of enslaved people forced to watch. He couldn't see the whipping clearly, but he could hear it and see blurred shapes. The crack of leather on flesh, Sarah's screams, the wet sound of blood hitting dirt. He heard all the lashes. He heard Sarah's screams turn to whimpers, turn to silence as she lost consciousness. He heard Marcus Webb's breathing heavy and excited, enjoying the violence. After the whipping, Sarah was cut down and dragged to the slave hospital, barely alive. The slave catchers were paid and left, laughing about how easy the capture had been. Thomas stood in the twilight shadows, listening to all of this, and felt something crystallize inside him. For years he had lived with his vision damaged, had turned it into strength, had become an archer despite impossible odds. And for what? To hunt rabbits while people like Sarah were hunted like animals and beaten nearly to death for wanting freedom. To live peacefully while men like Marcus Webb destroyed children's eyes and faced no consequences. Thomas made a decision that night. He would use his skill not for hunting food, but for hunting slave catchers, the men who made escape impossible. The men who dragged people back to brutality for money. Those men could be killed. And Thomas was the only person who could kill them without being caught, because he could kill in low light from distances no one would suspect. Possible. He was a teenager. He had a bow and years of practice, and he had nothing left to lose. The first months after that decision, Thomas did not kill anyone. This was not hesitation. This was preparation. Thomas understood that killing slave catchers required more than archery skill. It required intelligence about their patterns, routes they traveled, how they operated. He needed to learn the slave catcher profession from the inside without being suspected. Thomas's father, William, helped, though William didn't know what Thomas was planning. William had contacts with enslaved people on neighboring plantations through his carpentry work. He would hear about escape attempts, about which slave catchers were operating in the area, about routes escapees took toward Ohio. William shared this information with Thomas, thinking it would help Thomas avoid slave catchers while hunting. Actually, Thomas was mapping the slave catcher operation. Over time, Thomas learned that slave catchers worked mostly at night when runaways traveled, They used bloodhounds to track scent. They traveled in small groups, usually 2 to 4 men. They carried rifles and pistols, but rarely used them because dead runaways weren't worth bounty money. They followed predictable routes along known escape paths toward the Ohio River. Most critically, Thomas learned that slave catchers were most vulnerable when spread out searching forest terrain at night. They would separate to cover more ground, communicating by shouting to each other. This gave Thomas his opportunity. Isolated men in low light, their exact positions revealed by their own voices. While gathering intelligence, Thomas continued training with obsessive intensity. Every night he would go into the forest and practice shooting in low light. He developed new techniques specifically for hunting humans. He learned to shoot while lying prone, minimizing his profile. He learned to shoot and immediately moved to a different position before the target could locate him by arrow trajectory. He learned to make his own arrows with iron tips scavenged from plantation workshops, tips that could penetrate human flesh and bone far better than fire-hardened wood. He learned to calculate human height and vital organ locations, memorizing anatomy so he could target hearts, throats, major arteries without seeing them clearly. Most importantly, he practiced shooting at sounds that simulated human targets. He would have his father, William, walk through the forest, making natural human noises, breathing, footsteps, occasional words. Thomas would track William by sound and blurred sight and loose arrows that came close. This terrified William, but proved Thomas's capability. After preparation, Thomas was ready. He had identified his first target, Daniel Morrison, one of the 3 slave catchers who had captured Sarah. Morrison lived near the Kentucky-Tennessee border and operated primarily in Christian County. He was known for brutality toward captured runaways. His brother Robert often worked with him, but sometimes Daniel worked alone, especially on smaller jobs. Thomas learned through plantation networks that a man had escaped from a neighboring plantation and was heading north toward the Ohio River. Daniel Morrison had been hired to track him down. Morrison was searching the forest alone with his bloodhounds. This was Thomas's opportunity. Thomas told his father he was going hunting. He took his bow and arrows and went into the forest. He knew the area where Morrison was searching based on information from other enslaved people. Thomas positioned himself near a creek that ran through the forest, a natural waypoint where Morrison would likely pass. He climbed into a tree above the ground and waited. Being nearly blind, Thomas couldn't see Morrison approach clearly, but he heard everything and saw blurred shapes. As full darkness fell, Thomas heard bloodhounds baying in the distance. Getting closer, he heard Morrison's voice calling to his dogs. The sounds came within distance. Morrison was following the creek bank, his dogs sniffing for scent. Thomas listened to Morrison's movements, building a mental map of his exact position. Morrison stopped near Thomas's tree, standing still while his dogs investigated scent trails. Morrison was some distance from the tree trunk, facing away from Thomas's position above. Thomas drew his bow, a motion he had practiced thousands of times in low light. He aimed by sound and the dark blur, calculating Morrison's height and position based on his voice and footsteps. He targeted the center of Morrison's back where the heart would be. He loosed the arrow. The arrow struck Daniel Morrison between his shoulder blades, penetrating completely through his back and into his heart. Morrison made a choking sound and fell forward into the creek. Dead before his body hit the water, Thomas listened for any response. The bloodhounds were confused, but not aggressive. Thomas descended from the tree silently and moved away through the forest. He was away within minutes, moving by touch, sound, and memory through terrain he had mapped extensively. Morrison's body was found the next morning by his brother, Robert, who had come looking when Daniel didn't return home. Robert assumed Daniel had been killed by the escaped slave. A manhunt was organized, but the escapee was never found, having successfully reached Ohio while Thomas's arrow gave him time to escape. The investigation concluded Daniel Morrison was killed by a desperate runaway using a makeshift bow. No one suspected a nearly blind teenager from Harrison Plantation because the idea seemed impossible. This would be the pattern for the next years. Thomas Carter killed more slave catchers using similar methods. Ambush from concealment, arrows fired in low light. Death, immediate withdrawal. He did not rush, sometimes months passed between kills. He varied his locations across western Kentucky. He only killed slave catchers who were isolated or separated from partners. Every kill was planned meticulously. Thomas would learn about escape attempts through plantation networks. He would learn which slave catchers were hunting. He would position himself along likely routes and wait. Some waits lasted hours. Some lasted days, with Thomas staying motionless in trees or behind rocks. And when the moment came, he killed with precision that defied belief. Kill 2. Robert Morrison, Daniel's brother, killed while searching forests alone at night. Arrow through throat, died silently without alerting his partner. Kill 3. James Sutton, killed while separated from his group. Arrow through a socket into brain. Dead instantly. Kill 4. Marcus Webb. This one was personal. Webb was the overseer who had blinded Thomas years earlier. Webb had left the Harrison plantation to work as a slave catcher. Webb was hunting alone near a river crossing. Thomas had waited days in position. When Webb appeared, Thomas put an arrow through his heart in low light. Thomas felt no satisfaction, just cold completion. The man who destroyed his eyes was dead. Kills followed over the next years, each kill similar. Arrow in low light. Death. No witnesses. The psychological impact of these deaths was enormous. Even though only 13 men died over years, slave catchers in western Kentucky became terrified of hunting at night. Multiple slave catchers quit the profession entirely after colleagues were found dead with arrows in them. Those who continued worked only in daylight or in large groups that stayed together. The fear created a critical gap in the slave catcher network. Runaways who traveled at night through forests had dramatically higher success rates because slave catchers were too afraid to pursue them. Effectively, Thomas's 13 kills created a corridor of relative safety through western Kentucky that became legendary among enslaved people planning escapes. The stories of successful escapes enabled by Thomas's arrows became part of the Underground Railroad's oral history passed from plantation to plantation in whispers and coded songs. The first major escape enabled by Thomas's campaign happened after he killed Daniel Morrison. A family escaped from a plantation. They fled at night, heading for the Ohio River. Normally, Daniel Morrison would have tracked them with his bloodhounds within hours, but Daniel Morrison was dead. His brother Robert was too afraid to hunt alone at night after finding Daniel's body with an arrow through the back. The family traveled through forests for nights without pursuit. They reached the Ohio River and crossed into freedom. All survived because Thomas had killed the slave catcher who would have caught them. This pattern repeated many times over the years. The cumulative effect was extraordinary. In the years before Thomas started, successful escapes were fewer. After Thomas killed slave catchers, many more people escaped successfully. The total over the years, hundreds of documented successful escapes from the region compared to fewer in the years prior to Thomas's campaign. Thomas knew about many of these escapes through plantation networks. Freed people would sometimes send messages back through the Underground Railroad thanking the invisible arrow for making their freedom possible. Thomas never met most of the people he saved. He never saw their faces clearly because he saw little, but he heard their stories. The families reunited, the children born free, the lives lived in dignity instead of bondage. This knowledge sustained him through the crushing weight of 13 kills. Every death he caused enabled dozens of lives saved. Thomas experienced death in ways sighted people couldn't imagine. When he shot a slave catcher, he heard everything with clarity. The arrow leaving his bow with a specific whistling sound that told him trajectory and speed, the arrow striking flesh. The sound different depending on whether it hit muscle or bone or organs. The target's gasp or cry or silence, the body falling. The specific sound of dead weight hitting earth versus living person collapsing. The final exhale. Sometimes a rattle, sometimes a sigh, sometimes nothing. Thomas heard all of this in low light. his mind painting pictures from sound and blurry sight, pictures that haunted him for decades. The psychological toll was crushing. Despite his success, he was not a natural killer. He dreamed about the men he had killed, not with guilt exactly, but with the weight of 13 deaths carried in his mind. He heard their final sounds. Being nearly blind meant he experienced death primarily through sound and vague sight, which was somehow more intimate. He knew these men had chosen to hunt human beings for money. He knew they had dragged people back to slavery and torture. He knew killing them was justice in a system that provided no legal justice. But knowing didn't make the weight lighter. What kept him going was the knowledge that his kills mattered. Every slave catcher he killed made escape slightly more possible. Every arrow he loosed was fired on behalf of people like Sarah, who was beaten for wanting freedom. People like his younger self, whose eyes were destroyed by casual cruelty. Thomas was conducting asymmetric warfare, using the advantages of low vision, low light operation, enhanced hearing against the disadvantages of slave catchers, need for light, reliance on sight. He was proving that resistance was possible even for someone society considered helpless. The final kill came years after his campaign began. The target was a slave catcher known for exceptional cruelty. The slave catcher was hunting alone near the Ohio River, desperate and reckless. Thomas had positioned himself in a tree near the river crossing. At night, the slave catcher appeared, moving through forest, carrying a rifle and lantern. The lantern was supposed to help him see. Actually, it made him a perfect target, the light announcing his exact position while blinding him to anything outside the lantern's glow. Thomas drew his bow. He listened to the slave catcher's footsteps. His breathing calculated his position. He aimed at the sound and the lippler and loosed the arrow. The arrow struck the slave catcher in the heart. The slave catcher fell dead, his lantern falling and extinguishing. Thomas descended from his tree and walked away. This was his 13th kill. He was a young man. He had killed 13 slave catchers in years and was never caught. And then, the war was ending and slavery was ending and Thomas's campaign was ending. Time later, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered. Later, the 13th Amendment was ratified, ending slavery across the United States. Thomas Carter was free. He was a young man and nearly blind and had killed 13 men and enabled hundreds of escapes. What would he do now? Thomas and his parents remained in Kentucky. Initially, the Harrison plantation dissolved and many formerly enslaved people scattered. But Thomas's father, William, had skills as a carpenter that were valuable even in freedom. He found work in Louisville, building houses for free people. Thomas came with his parents and continued hunting, now legally selling game for income. Years later, Thomas met a woman named Ruth, who had been enslaved on a plantation near Louisville and had escaped to Ohio. Ruth had heard legends of the invisible arrow during her escape and had wondered who the mysterious archer was. When she met Thomas and learned he was nearly blind, but an extraordinary archer, she began to suspect. Ruth and Thomas talked for months before he told her the truth about his 13 kills. Ruth's response was unambiguous. "You saved my life. I escaped through western Kentucky. The slave catchers were afraid to hunt at night. That's the only reason I made it. You were the reason they were afraid. You saved my life, and hundreds of others." Thomas and Ruth married. They had children. Thomas worked as a hunter and craftsman making bows and arrows. He never killed another human being after that final shot. He didn't need to. The system he fought against was dead. But the weight of 13 deaths never fully left him. Years later, Thomas was old. A journalist named Frederick Davis was collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved people. Davis heard rumors about Thomas Carter and the invisible arrow legend. He tracked down Thomas and asked directly, "Were you the nearly blind archer who killed slave catchers?" Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he said yes. Davis spent time interviewing Thomas, documenting everything. How he was blinded, how he learned to shoot, how he planned each kill, how he felt about the 13 deaths. Davis asked Thomas if he felt guilty about killing 13 men. Thomas's answer was clear. I feel nothing for those 13 men. They chose to hunt human beings for money. They chose to drag people back to slavery and torture. They chose evil work. I just chose to stop them. The only guilt I carry is that I couldn't kill more of them, that I couldn't save everyone. Everything I did was to honor my father who taught me despite my blindness. To honor Sarah, who was beaten for wanting freedom. To honor every person who suffered because slave catchers existed. I killed 13 men and enabled hundreds of escapes. That's the mathematics that matters. 13 evil men dead, hundreds of families saved. I'll face God with those numbers. Davis published Thomas's confession in a newspaper. The article described Thomas's campaign in detail, the methods, the patience, the skill, the 13 kills, the escapes enabled. White newspapers in Kentucky denounced the article as impossible fiction. A nearly blind person couldn't kill 13 men with arrows in low light, but the facts checked out. 13 slave catchers had indeed died mysteriously in western Kentucky during those years. All killed by arrows, cases never solved. Thomas Carter had been real, had been blinded by Marcus Webb, had lived afterward. The confession was probably true. The story created controversy that lasted years. Some called Thomas a murderer, others called him a hero. Thomas didn't care about either label. He had done what needed doing with the skills he had despite impossible obstacles. He had turned vision impairment from disability into weapon. He had killed slave catchers and saved hundreds of lives. Whether people understood or approved was irrelevant. Thomas Carter died in Louisville, Kentucky. He was an old man. He had been nearly blind for most of his life since childhood. He had killed 13 slave catchers between his teenage years and young adulthood. He had lived many more years in freedom, married, had children and grandchildren, worked as a bowyer, and died surrounded by family. His grave marker reads simply Thomas Carter. Husband, father, craftsman, he lived free. His children didn't learn about their father's past until after his death when they read Frederick Davis's article. They couldn't reconcile it with the gentleman who had made toys and told stories and never raised his voice. But Thomas's oldest son, William, named after his grandfather, understood. He kept a copy of the article and passed it down through the family. That article still exists today in archives. You can read Thomas's confession yourself, describing how he learned to kill by sound and blurred sight alone, how he planned each ambush, how he felt shooting arrows into low light, knowing each shot would end a life or miss completely. How he earned his freedom by becoming what the system forced him to become. Thomas Carter died. He was an old man, had been severely visually impaired for most of his life, had killed 13 slave catchers between his youth, and had lived many more years carrying the psychological weight of those deaths while knowing they enabled hundreds to reach freedom. His story wasn't about a perfect warrior who never missed or never felt guilt. It was about a terrified, nearly blind teenager who missed more shots than he hit, who heard men dying slowly from his arrows and had nightmares for 60 years, who developed PTSD, kept going because the alternative was watching people like Sarah beaten to death for wanting freedom. He wasn't supernatural. He was human, broken, traumatized, but effective enough to make a difference despite his limitations. 13 deaths over years at terrible psychological cost to himself enabled hundreds of escapes. That's the mathematics. Whether the cost was worth it, each person must decide.